Pop, where'd you find so many ideas?
Well, I mined for 'em.
What about inspiration? Don't inspiration come into it?
Son, you got two options. Either wait 20 years for gold to wash up on your shores, or get out there and find it yourself.
I've always seen story writing to be like cartography. The story itself is an island, the kind dense in bushes and trees and rivers. Basically just one long stretch of obstacles. Our job as writers is to cut through it, to find that one story that weaves through the island to a resolution. So what do you do when you have 2 points in a story and no way to connect them? Or even worse, you can see the story in perfect detail until that one point, that moment where nothing. You can wait for inspiration. People do. They wait a decade for the perfect story to form in their heads. But I'm an impatient man. When I run into a problem, I don't like writing to do on my page and moving on. I zero in and solve it at that moment. I actually believe having the mindset that you will solve a problem is half the battle. If you go in to solve a problem expecting to fail, your mind will give up at the first hurdle. Mine certainly has when I've given it the permission. So, you're stuck, you're ready to solve the problem, let's get into it. The reason a story doesn't move forward is the fault of the author. We have a subconscious vision for how things ought to play out, an idea of what is and is not in line with our story and our characters' behaviors. There are even parts of the world that we try not to look too closely at. Those mental restrictions are the reason it's so hard to break a plot barrier. How do we break those mental blocks? We've got to weaponize the rhetorical tools of philosophers. Nothing crazy, nothing from the last 2,000 years, but we do need to talk about a man named Socrates. This was the kind of guy that'd walk up to you on the street and start a conversation with a question like, what is justice? And if you took the time to answer him, he'd poke holes in your answer until you looked like a fool. This, in short, is the Socratic method. And it's the best tool for picking away at a frozen story. In our case, we play both Socrates and the poor victim on the street that answers questions. Let's no longer talk in the abstract. Let's imagine a simple story. A knight and a knightess charge into a dragon's den, and then a blank. We don't know what's going to happen next, we just know the dragon's defeated somehow. So for our purposes, we are going to use the Socratic method to solve this problem. The first step to the Socratic method is asking a question. How do we defeat a dragon? Sword to the heart? This dragon isn't that weak. Big ballista? We forgot to bring one. Collapse the cave? We haven't invented explosives yet. If you're not making progress, the question might be too big. We're trying to bite off way more than a dragon can chew here, so we have to shrink smaller. What kind of strengths does this dragon have? Well, it's really wormy. It can wiggle down tunnels and chomp its way through nights. That's why it's so dangerous. Well, this smaller question has now identified some unique characteristics, the kind that provide us opportunities. Suddenly, more questions begin to arise. I said that wiggling down tunnels was a strength, but was that an assumption? Maybe wiggling down tunnels presents a weakness. Maybe our knightess could lure the dragon down a tunnel and our knight could light a fire. Already a story starts to form where previously there was a blank. It's a silly example, but it's one to highlight the process. Sometimes you start with a big question that's too big, and you need to zoom in on the story. Sometimes the answers you give are a little dishonest. It's easy to say, oh, this dragon is impervious while he's wiggling down a tunnel, but as a writer, sometimes you can feel in your gut that you're lying to yourself. When you get that feeling, when you ask a question and the answer feels a little dishonest, say it out loud. Ask the question. Am I tricking myself to keep the story simple? Is the dragon actually weak when it's wiggling down a tunnel? Sometimes the questions get a lot harder. Do I really need this character? Is this entire plot line one big distraction? Should I cut it? It hurts. It's uncomfortable. I've had to cut 5 characters down to 3. I've had to skip major scenes because I realized they didn't serve a purpose. The Socratic method is built to spark self-reflection. It is built to root out your subconscious biases and force you to take a step back in your story. The Socratic method should take you halfway to a breakthrough. Often those key questions that you ask yourself build connections in your head between events, between characters that weren't there before. But there are times when the Socratic method stops. The easiest way to know you've reached a dead end is when you give the answer, I don't know. What kind of strengths does the dragon have? I don't know. Who's behind that evil organization? I don't know. If you don't know what happens, or you don't have any ideas, it's time to start churning them out. It's time to take a tap it into your brain, and get those concepts dripping out onto the page. I mentioned earlier you need a problem-solving attitude to force a breakthrough. This is where that attitude comes into play. The first step is knowing what question to answer. We found that when we said I don't know to one of the Socratic method's questions. But just to shake it up, let's brainstorm a totally new story. The new question is, who is behind the evil organization? So you have a question. Let's start brainstorming. This is a simple process of writing down every idea as soon as you have it and then moving on. No single idea should get too much of your attention. Let the ideas flow. Who's behind the evil organization? It's the president. It's the guy who robbed the protagonist at the start. Maybe take some cool ones from other stories. It's the protagonist's father. It's Hades, the god of the underworld. And then do some silly joke ones. It's the protagonist's kid brother, or it's the dog. As a side note, my silly joke ideas are usually my best ideas. So we have a wall of ideas. If none of these ideas pop out to you, don't worry, we're not done. These ideas need space to grow. We need to allow our minds to imagine. What if Hades, the god of the underworld, ran this mafia? It might explain some of the supernatural stuff happening earlier. Maybe that double agent that works for him is actually Persephone. And what if the people who join this mafia actually surrender their souls? Let it stew. Let's do another one. What if the dog was the mafia boss? That's why it's been following us around all the time. That's why the front is a pet store. That's why there's no other dogs in the city. It's a dog-eat-dog world, and this dog ate. Every answer has its pros and cons. Only you know the tone and context of your story. But the key to making brainstorming work is to let every answer be correct, if only for a moment. And trust your gut. There's a reason you instinctively liked having the kid brother be the mob boss. Later down the road, you might realize that that idea was way better than you realized at the time. A half-baked idea often just needs time to rise. As someone who really likes hard science stories, even in my fantasy, I need a fleshed out world with a really specific magic system. World building is what the Socratic method is best at. If you let it go too far, it might drag you into writing about the courting rituals of North Empire elves. But well controlled, it can give you all the answers you need for a story. And the process doesn't stop with plot. Everything I just described translates to character arcs as well. Why does Gerard keep putting himself in debt with people? Is he afraid of working without a goal? Where did that feeling come from? With characters, it starts to sound like therapy less than the Socratic method, but the fundamentals are the same. Give it a try yourself. Take a stab at that part of the story you don't like looking at. Assail it with a bunch of questions. Generate a wall of answers and assess every one. Pick one at random. See how it turns out. The goal in all of this is to finish your story. Shatter the block or chip a few feet further into it. Progress is always worth it. This next week, I'm going to be talking about The Dark Forest. More epic sci-fi series to come. Thanks for watching.